Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Merci d'être parmi nous aujourd'hui. I'm Ted Hewitt, President of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, or SHRC for short. I'd like to acknowledge that SHRC's offices are situated on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And as we're meeting in a virtual environment and from various locations, we also acknowledge from coast to coast to coast the ancestral and traditional territory of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who call this land home. I'm very pleased on behalf of SHRC to launch the second cycle of our public talk series, In Conversation With, which we offer in partnership with the Conversation Canada. Le CRSH est l'organisme fédéral de financement de la recherche au Canada, qui soutient la formation en
The SSHRC is the federal organization that funds research in Canada and supports research training and research in human sciences. The researchers and students that it supports help better understand the human condition, along with human thought, behavior, customs, and societal functioning. The work of specialists and disciplines in the human sciences have never been more essential to overcoming the challenges facing society and to seize new opportunities, including the post-pandemic recovery, climate change, the environment, and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples.
Canada to bring the perspectives of some of Canada's best and brightest scholars to the public. These talks provide a unique forum where we can hear directly from academics who have important views based on scientific research to share. Their research can enrich our understanding of people and world affairs. Today, our distinguished guest is Cindy Blackstock. Dr. Blackstock is a professor at the School of Social Work at McGill University and the executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada. She's dedicated her career to the structural inequities in First Nations child welfare services, the overrepresentations of First Nations children in care, and the development of policies to address these issues. Ses travaux remarquables et son action en tant que militant infatigable des droits et de l'égalité des Premières.
Her incredible work and tireless activism on First Nations rights and equality have allowed Canadians to become aware of the extent of systemic discrimination experienced by First Nations children and their families.
Dr. Blackstock has collaborated with other Indigenous leaders to assist the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child in the development and adoption of a general comment on the rights of Indigenous children as well. Le CRSH est fier de souligner les contributions impressionnantes de Cindy Blackstock et l'impact énorme de ses travaux.
The SSHRC is proud to highlight Cindy Blackstock's impressive contributions and the enormous impact of her work by awarding her the gold medal in 2022. Suvinita Srivastava, senior editor of the Culture and Society Desk at the Conversation Canada, is joining Cindy Blackstock today. She hosts the podcast Don't Call Me Resilient, produced by.
Je vous remercie encore une fois d'être des nôtres. And now I will hand things over to Vinita and to Dr. Blackstock. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted, for your welcome and for your introduction. I just have a couple of notes about access before we start. Closed captioning and simultaneous interpretations are available for this event. And if you click on the link below the video screen, you'll see the simultaneous interpretation, and you'll have to select the globe language icon in the top right of the screen for simultaneous interpretation. Also, number two, housekeeping note is today's conversation will be followed by at least a 15-minute Q&A. And we'd like you to please submit your questions at any time throughout this conversation, English or in French, and use the Ask a Question function in the top right of the platform. I hope I got all of that correct. If somebody needs to correct me, please do so. And so to begin, I just will quickly introduce myself. My name is Vinita Srivastava. I am the senior editor at The Conversation Canada. I'm also the host of the podcast, Don't Call Me Resilient, where we tackle systemic racism head on and the things that no one should have to be resilient for. I'm actually speaking to you from my backyard studio in Toronto, where we have recorded many of our episodes. As with many projects, Don't Call Me Resilient is a team effort. And I just like to shout out my team really quickly. My team currently right now is made up of Jennifer Moroz, Athika Kaki, Ollie Nicholas, Ramatullah Sheikh, and Danielle Piper. And Scott White is the CEO of The Conversation Canada. A tiny bit of context about me before we jump into our conversation. I've been a journalist for about 25 years. I've also worked as an assistant professor of journalism. So I have a little bit of insight into some of the obstacles within the academy that Professor Cindy Blackstock has so successfully hurdled over. And although she calls herself a misfit scholar who has been searching for oxygen within Canadian institutions, Cindy Blackstock has found a strong footing inside scholarship. Professor Blackstock, as you heard from Ted, has been working for years to provide evidence of ongoing harms of Indian residential schools, to give voice to Indigenous children, and to seek accountability from the Canadian government for the harms that have been done to them as a result of the genocide of Indigenous peoples. Her and her team had a big win in 2018 when the Liberal government announced funding for a comprehensive plan for Indigenous children based on Professor Blackstock's Spirit Bear plan. Professor Blackstock says that she cannot envision academia not being in service of the public good, and she wants to see more space made for activism in academia. Cindy, it's an honor to be having this conversation with you today.
Well, I'm just so delighted to be here. I really am.
Thank you. When we chatted last, you told me that you were a child growing up as a member of the Gitxsan First Nation, that at that time you didn't know anyone who had seen the inside of a high school, let alone a university. So tell me a little bit more about that. Even though you didn't know anyone who had experienced the inside of a high school, did you still dream of it for yourself, this higher education goal?
You know what? I was already getting higher education out there from my community and being taught in a different way that I would later leverage in life as being really enabling me to do the work I do now. But I was born in 1964. Keep in mind that up until 1960, the Canadian government, through the Indian Act, really did not allow First Nations folks to go to university without renouncing your First Nations identity. So the fact that no one in my circle had been to university wasn't because of lack of will. It was they were blockaded in that. I remember first going into grade 1, and I actually thought I was fortunate enough not to go to residential schools. They were operating back then, but I grew up in the bush and the Indian Asians didn't occasion upon me, so I was pretty lucky. But I was the only First Nations kid in grade 1. And I actually thought, you know what, I can't cut it here. I must be stupid. I just can't make it. Because what I was being taught before is that the most important things about living a good life in a way that brings honor to your ancestors and sets a foothold for the generations to follow are to really search throughout your lifetime to answer, what does love look like? What does generosity look like? What does integrity look like? What does encourage look like? And how does that activate within expansive concepts of time, space, and relationship? And when I got to grade 1, that was not the way I was taught. And then I still remember the day leaving grade 1. And finally, the light had turned on. And I realized that you were smart in Western education to the degree that nobody else understood you. If I threw out a word from the dictionary that no other kid in grade 1 had, I was all of a sudden smart. And that is true up and through your PhD and through academia. And so it in many ways, it segments us naturally from the people who were privileged to learn from and live among in society, and for whom I feel that we owe a sacred duty, because our language, the way that we express knowledge, and the way that we serve them becomes so inaccessible to them, so distant from them. And I think that that's part of the danger. But yeah, I remember one of my distant family members came and was describing this place where you could go and learn stuff that you were only interested in. And I thought, this is fabulous. And my first job was being a pine cone picker. I'd pick pine cones. I was hearing that you had to pay for this place, though, and all I can remember is I think it was $1,000 to go to UBC back then, and I just thought, how many bags of pine cones do I have to pick to go to UBC? And I was just determined to go there, and part of the reason is because in society nobody expected me to do it. You know, the stereotypes are out there. You're going to grow up and be on welfare, be a drunk Indian. Well, none of that interested me.
So what did interest you? What drew you to this idea of, like, what did you know? Oh, this is what I want to be when I grow up.
Oh, no, not at all. You know, like I was not one of those people that was born and had an instinct about it. And part of it was because the societal messages about what was possible for me were capped. Yeah. And I just found myself resisting this cap at every time, right? These caricatures of who I was to be like and who my family and community were to be like were not the world that I saw for myself. I wanted to see beyond what others expected of me. What did capture my imagination very early on is the unfair treatment of people. And I think it's because in some ways I was being treated that way myself, my family was, and my community was. I didn't have the words to describe discrimination back then, but it was clearly all around me, infiltrating society. And the time when I got to kind of get a sense of it, a better sense of it, is when I would see the civil rights movement on TV in black and white back then. And I've always been a talker. And so I'd be talking to the townspeople, these same people who would say, well, you know, they're a bunch of drunk Indians, whatever. And they would be appalled at what was happening to Black folks in the United States. Yet they would hold these racist attitudes themselves. And so the puzzle of how systemic racism really pulls out was something that always captured me. And I would find myself, even when I would have points of departure, I became quite an arrogant teenager who thought that the social sciences were for people who didn't succeed in the hard sciences. So I was in hard sciences. I find myself like a magnetic pole always being brought back to these questions of unfairness and trying to unpack how we actually reverse that in society. Why is it that we're treating each other this way? Why is it that we're not acting in concert with some of these basic human teachings, which I was blessed to learn from the community that was around me before I entered grade 1?
But you sort of talk about this pretense, you know, of academia, like the big words, and you know. So I'm just wondering, because you came with this vision of justice and fairness, and then you chose to use this academic platform to do it, and it doesn't seem like the most obvious choice. Like you could have done so many other things. What was it that drew you to this academic, like higher academic environment?
You know, it was one really fueled by desperation, I would say, because as years went on, it became clear to me that the unfair treatment of First Nations kids, that we really have apartheid public services in Canada, really coming from the Indian Act, which is still with us. That's a piece of legislation that forced kids into the residential schools. And what it does is it requires the federal government to fund services for First Nations folks on reserve, from water to everything else. And they do so at lower levels. That captured my imagination. So as I did what probably every academic advisor would advise their students not to do, in that I was not thinking taking a degree to get a job, to be something. I was taking these various degrees to do something. So my first degree was to kind of fulfill this dream of UBC, but I ended up taking a Bachelor of Arts in psychology. And that was to kind of one step in this journey of dealing with these inequalities. But when that wasn't then I started, well, how do you, we need to set up an organization to kind of really challenge Canada, because that needs to be done, and to do the research to really document these inequalities. So we did that, but I didn't know how to set up an organization. So I got a master's in management from McGill. And then I got my PhD in social work, because I figured that I've been doing social work for so long, I should probably learn something about that. And then I got my law degree from Chicago, because I wanted to know more about how to litigate. And we were in the middle of the litigation of the human rights thing. So it really was having a vision of what is the contribution that I'd like to make in a company of many other people, and curating my own academic training and relationships around that goal.
That is incredible. Once you became, tell me about this, because we are talking about academia and activism. Why do you think they need to go hand in hand? What's your...
Well, why do we produce evidence in the social sciences and humanities? Is to make a contribution to a better world, to enrich those social and human relationships we have with one another. And what I had seen when in the inequalities is that these had been documented for decades and centuries before I was ever on the scene. You know, Vinita, I don't know about you, but there's often an assumption when you see something that's a dramatic human rights abuse, that the reason it's perpetrated by governments like Canada is because they don't know any better. And if they do know better, they don't have a solution that's workable to fix, quote, the complex problem.
Well, that's generous. You know, that's generous. That they don't know any better is generous. That's very...
Yeah, exactly. And it's often not rooted in reality. Like this is a report from National Crime, written in 1922 by Canada's own former chief medical inspector, who walked into the residential schools, found dramatic inequalities in healthcare, and linked that to the preventable deaths of children in the ground. Had they listened to him in 1922, or any of the mountain of other reports documenting the inequalities, we would have never had to bring the case, along with the Assembly of First Nations, against Canada to remedy its own inequalities. And I think that that's the piece, is that we can actually be fellow travelers in a colonial enterprise by failing to take the responsibility on of implementing the evidence-based solutions. We give the appearance as if we're doing something, when actually nothing is changing for the people who are most experiencing the hardship of that human rights abuse.
Let me ask you a minute about social work, because you're talking about going hand in hand and working hand in hand. And you said that you worked in social work for a long time and then decided to go do this degree. Yeah. And I think I think many of us, when we think about social work, we think of it as inherently a space of activism. Do you agree that this has been the case? I feel like there's some changes happening there as well.
Yeah, I've long been concerned that we are losing our focus on remedying social injustice and standing in the winds of discrimination with other groups who are facing that systemic disadvantage, and getting more into the therapeutic realm. And that's not to discredit that work, that's important work. But I think that we need to do a far better job across a bunch of disciplines, frankly, of teaching people how to advocate on an evidence-informed way, because evidence is really critical, Vinita, between being right and doing right. When I see a lot of stuff in the name of protest these days, when there's kind of like, I'm acting in the public good with no evidence to really hook that to, that's what holds you accountable to the public good, is actually acting on that evidence. But we then don't teach students adequately, I think, about how to do so in a way that is in cohort with one of the elders, Elmer Courchain, called loving justice. And that means that you have to work on a basis of love to defeat the darkness. You have to work in a place of light and with an open hand that welcomes others into the circle to defeat the darkness of human rights abuses. And you have to have courage, and you have to be willing to sacrifice. We don't teach courage when we talk about codes of ethics in academia. It's like, sign on to this code of ethics. Well, everybody will do it. But courage is actually not a value. Courage is an activator of values. And we have to train people in professions when they see a human rights abuse to be courageous within their professions, within their academic streams, to say, no, hold on here, we have to do something. And even if that's taking on a powerful actor that may have some influence over your personal, professional well-being or the institution's well-being, we have an obligation. That's why we have academic freedom, is we stand in this space protected so that we can stand with those who are most affected by the human rights abuses that are around us.
Let me just talk a minute with you about your own courage. Was there, you talk about this report that came out in 1922 and then 1964. There's been many times when you're sort of coming up against these things over and over again. Was there any point when you just wanted to give it up or, step away or do something different? Was there any point when you're like, I need to throw the towel in here?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And there's lots of times when I get crabby too, right? I tell people, sometimes this stuff is not easy to deal with.
No.
But then you have to ask yourself the question, well, what happens if you do give up, right? I really feel that every life has a purpose. And if you're really, really lucky and blessed, you get to leave the world in a little better place than what you found it. And I have been blessed to work with First Nations folks and other allies around Canada and around the globe to try and address these inequalities. And I've always thought about the kids. I thought, what's the message I send them if I give up?
Yeah,
I'm sending them the message that I'm too tired to care about you and love you anymore. And I only stand in these spaces. I'm only able to go to get a degree. I'm only able to have my national organization and do so many things because the elders before me sacrificed so deeply, including the children in residential schools. I owe them a debt I will never be able to repay, but the little I can do is to pay it forward for the next generation of kids.
Mm-hmm. And you've had so many successes in your career. It's amazing to read about, and it's been a pleasure to learn more deeply about your work. Can you tell us about one that you consider to be one of your greatest achievements? And maybe you could walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, I'd say none of my achievements are just mine alone. That's the thing about working in community and social justice. It's everybody's. And that's why I was so grateful for SSHRC for recognizing this collective work for kids. I think for me, the greatest success is really out of that work from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case, where we are in active litigation against Canada. And there were several transformations that came from that. First of all, when we filed the legal case against Canada, the Canadian government cut all of our funding for our organization within 30 days. And we only had $50,000 in the bank, and we weren't sure how we were going to carry this off. But we wanted to show the kids that we loved them enough to fight for them. And that meant to sacrifice. And if that's the only message we could send them, we were going to do that. But out of that, we saw community surrounding us and doing what they could to volunteer and pitch in this, what became a collective effort to hold Canada accountable and to stand up for the rights of this generation of First Nations kids. Then we created a campaign called I Am a Witness, which invited people of all diversities in Canada to simply watch the case. We didn't ask them to take a side. We said, just watch and make up your own mind about whether the government of Canada, in the wake of residential schools, is treating First Nations children fairly. And one of the first groups to come there were actually young children themselves. Because what I had found in academia and among the adult population is that we were all bathed in this colonial kind of mind control, if you like, propaganda that normalized this discrimination, and in many cases even pitched it as benevolent. But for children of all diversities who were just now learning about residential schools back then, they just didn't make any excuses for this unfairness. What do you mean they don't get the same level of health? That's not fair. And they would come and then bring their parents. And so seeing children of all diversities and then the broader Canadian public becoming more aware of this unfairness and demanding change from Canada was a big thing. And then seeing the litigation also, the losses by the Canadian government as they tried to obfuscate responsibility, the courts consistently at the tribunal holding them accountable. So we ended up at a moment where we walk into communities where children are no longer having the number of feeding tubes that they can have per day capped by the government of Canada, and parents are not having to decide whether they feed their kids or rewash those tubes. We're seeing families get access to basic public services their kids already always should have. And we're seeing for the first time, Vanita, in Canadian history, there's now money for First Nations families to stay together instead of money to split them apart. We got a lot of work to do, and we're not done with the Canadian government yet. But I think we've collectively been able to show those kids that we love them. And we've been able to also show those kids that they will never be alone again, because now there's a generation of children of all diversities and a growing awareness in the public that'll make sure that they keep an eye on them.
That actually leads to my next question, which is, what are you working on now? Because you were talking about this great project about working with children and educating them in a particular way. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we had children were naturally involving themselves in this litigation and in this broader movement towards equity. And in fact, there's children like Jordan River Anderson and Shannon Kustachin who are really at the center of our work, actually leading that activism or inspiring that activism itself. So we wanted to kind of get a sense about how is this actually turning out? Because we got critiques from members of the public and even some academics. Well, aren't you politicizing the children? Aren't you exposing them to politics? And I said, absolutely, I'm exposing them to politics. But what I'm not doing is exposing them to partisan politics. What we're teaching them is that people in parliament and in legislatures make decisions that will affect children. And children have a right to learn about this stuff and then actually have their voices heard in that way. And that's in alignment with international human rights through the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But we wanted to see, what does that look like for children? So through the generosity of SSHRC and with some fabulous colleagues at the University of Ottawa, we've been working with teachers to describe what that looks like and what are some of the effects on kids. And what we're finding is that children's compassion writ large is better when they're actually not just learning about other kinds of human rights abuses, but becoming fellow travelers in implementing the solutions that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has mapped out for us. They are learning agency at a young age, right? How do you do peaceful and respectful advocacy? They're learning how to do that in real time. And the other thing I'm hoping to do, Vanita, is kind of make this kind of activism and service to the public much more valued across the board in the humanities and social sciences for academics. What I find was a struggle for me, and I want to thank McGill for kind of taking that struggle and making it a possible one, is that often when First Nations, Métis, and Inuit academics walk into spaces, we have duties, as I did, to the community. And yet we're asked to kind of go and teach 4 undergrad courses, plus serve on every, quote, Indigenous community known to man, plus do all this other stuff. And the service to our community is the stuff that's weighted the least. You know, research is there, there's monies for teachings, but when it comes to actually working with the community and implementing, I think that we can recalibrate even our ways that we fund service, the way we do tenure and promotion, that really honors Indigenous peoples and also really honors the service and the duty we owe the public. Because if you saw my CV, the stuff that we just talked about in a traditional academic setting in many humanities and social sciences wouldn't really be valued that much. All my appearances in the media, all my work in the courtroom, along with the fabulous legal counsel team we have, that kind of stuff doesn't weigh as much as getting a research grant. And I think we can recalibrate it and do both. Make sure we have the really good evidence to work on it, and make sure we're supporting great activists out there who are changing things for the better for our collective benefit.
Yeah, maybe that service line that universities are hoping for could not just be in service of, as you say, the committee work at the university, but in service of the community around you, or in partnership with, you know, the communities around you.
And valuing those people who are prepared to get into some trouble, you know. I mean, this is the thing. Like I say to the young people, I said, look, you know, getting into trouble for doing the wrong thing, that's for amateurs, right? Getting into trouble for doing the right thing, that takes a lot of skill, discipline, and commitment. And we know that from some of the great civil rights leaders of our time, right? All of us need to be prepared to get into trouble. And that's where that thing around courage and the question of what are we prepared to sacrifice to do it, right? And to really kind of leave the space behind us in these academic circles. So it's not a fight to find those spaces where you can do both. You can do your duty to community, and you can do your duty to the academic community. It should be something that's fostered, supported, and promoted.
I mean, I love this this idea that you're talking about courage and fostering it, even, and you know, this idea of social justice, or this idea of introducing it to children at such a young age. It is a little bit, I mean, speaking as a parent, I always wonder, how do you do that with children without, you know, devastating them with the information that we're giving them? It's a slow, it's a kind of, it has to be done very carefully and a really interesting in a really interesting way. But the idea of how do you foster courage is such an interesting question. I love that idea, and I wish that we spent a little bit more time on that, because it does take so much courage to do what you're talking about, and to be bad for all the right reasons takes courage inside a very large institution. Can you tell us a little bit about, I know that you said that when you started, you received some advice from your elders about how to survive and stick to your mission without getting subsumed by the large institution. So I guess maybe, do you still follow that advice that you received? Can you share a little bit about it?
Absolutely. Like when we were trying to set up the Caring Society. That's our short form of the First Nations Caring Society. And we were so excited. We finally got a telephone line. We could afford actually for somebody to have a recording out of the other phone. And an elder was in our circle. And he said, never fall in love with the Caring Society, and never fall in love with your business card. Only fall in love with the children. Because there may come a day when you have to sacrifice both those things for them. And one of the things I think in academia that, you know, we're taught to fall in love with our CVs, to pad the CVs. And that's the way the whole system, like that's your currency in these places. But I think that the academics I admire, and there are many of them out there across all kinds of disciplines, are the ones that fall in love with the people. That all of that, their CVs aren't padded intentionally. They're as part of their work and commitment to doing what they do, giving generously of their special gift. It just fills up naturally. But their focus is on, how can I be of service today? And that's what I'd like to see academia kind of become more of. It's easy to serve on all kinds of committees and you know, just sit there with a cup of coffee and throw in a few comments. And I should say I'm biased against committees. I'm not a very good committee person myself. And that's not to say they don't do good work, but you know what I mean. Like, I mean, keep the focus on the what you're supposed to be doing, not on all these diversions that are around you.
I do. I understand. I understand those committees can be something that, as you say, it fills up your CV instead of thinking about how you can actually get out there. At the same time, I understand that the structure is in place for so many scholars that have to, you know, trying to, especially junior scholars, you know, who are stepping into a tenure track position where they have to really shake up things, shake up the structure, as well as try and follow their own path, the idea of
that's right,
following with love and courage and all of those things that you're talking about.
It's all there. And I think this is my call to universities and academia more generally, is that we need to restructure it so that the incentive is to give generously of whatever your gift is. And I mean, that's always been the reason why we do evidence-based kind of stuff, is that we have that accountability back to the evidence, which provides the best guidance on making sure we're doing the right thing versus being right. But then how do we take the brilliant people and ideas that are floating around universities and curate them for the largest public benefit? That's I think the time to recalibrate. Let's face it. Like, I heard a statistic that 85% of journal articles don't even get read. So why are we spending so much time writing for journal articles, right? They serve a purpose. Peer review is important, but I think we got some of these legacies that just get handed down from generation to generation in academia, and I think it's time to question some of them.
Well, I guess that peer review is really important, because what you're talking about is you need the evidence. You have to have the evidence to push things forward. Yeah. And at the same time, you said we've got reams of evidence that this genocide has occurred. So we need to start also getting that evidence out there into a more public kind of forum, perhaps.
And not just focusing on like sharing a paper at a conference, right? It brings us back to that grade 1 conversation. We have to express ourselves in ways that people can actually understand what we're saying. Yes. And then and also listen very carefully to the evidence that they have from their own experience, right? To get rid of this privilege kind of system of knowledge, and then really kind of implement it, right? Where we have, like in my case, evidence of dramatic inequalities that are leading to historic levels of families separations that are unnecessary, and even the deaths of children. You don't just publish another paper in the wake of that. The answer has to be like, let's do something about this. Let's try our very best to end that inequality.
Do you have any advice for folks in the institutions that we're talking about? How would you suggest things might be changed to allow others to more easily follow in your footsteps?
Well, I mean, I give a shout out to McGill for this, because I think one of the things that they did for me is they didn't put me in a position where I had to choose between my work and my duty to community and what I could do in academia. So, and the conversation went something like this, is that this movement to address these inequalities for our First Nations kids, so that to raise a generation of First Nations kids that don't have to recover from their childhoods, that is at the community level. In many generations of First Nations folks have been working on this, along with non-Indigenous allies, like Dr. Bryce, the author of A National Crime. You can build a, quote, Indigenous unit in your university, and it'll have some impact. But the real impact is when you get behind these community-led kind of movements and support them. Be generous in reconciliation, be practical in reconciliation. So they put up with me as a professor, and I'm very grateful to them. I don't show up at a lot of staff meetings or committees, but I do teach, and I do my public education, do my research, but they have created space so that I can do this work with community. And that allows us to get out of this, to occupy a space in academia where we aren't in a direct funding relationship with Canada, because in communities, they are funding the First Nations. So if you tackle Canada, there's a risk that there might be some kind of reduction in your funding kind of thing. If we're in an academic space and the university is funding our salary, then we have more freedom to do that kind of activism. That's one. And number two is really take a look at those service pieces. Make sure that you're valuing that work. So many people, it's not just First Nations, Métis and Inuit academics, others as well, have done enormous work on really with community. And I think that should be much more highly valued.
More than perhaps it is currently right now.
Yeah, and funding sources. Yeah. Maybe SHRC one day could have a research implementation grants.
I think they're here listening.
Yeah, I think they are too.
I'm wondering, I think we have some questions coming in, and I'm just going to once again invite people to send your questions in. I want to say before we get into our question, Cindy, thank you so much for all of your time right now and all of your contributions to this fascinating conversation. It's gone by so quickly. We've already, if you can believe it, it's already 11:40, and I know, and I have been instructed to head over to the Q&A section. So I just wanted to start reading a few of them if I can.
Oh,
and
yeah.
And in between, okay, so here's the first question. I don't know who it's from, so I'm sorry, I'm going to just read the question. I love you and what you bring to the table. I'm an activist for disability rights, and I have been working with academics for the last 25 years to get the evidence that we need to improve the lives and outcomes for injured and disabled workers and their families. Do you have any suggestions about how we can strengthen our relationships with academics and public institutions?
Well, the one thing I do is, and I encourage my academic colleagues to do this, is we have a bias towards knowledge that's being produced now and tomorrow, and a particular bias to stuff that's done in journals. When we're looking at, has this particular social injustice been documented, and has there been remedies? We have to become better at digging into the archives of various university libraries and into literature that's not just cloistered into the peer review. And one of the things that I would really encourage you to think about is actually the number of master's and PhD students out there who are looking at actually wanting to do their dissertations, but wanting to make a contribution at the same time. And if you're one of those PhD and master's students, think about reaching out and seeing if you could work with organizers, such as the person who's writing in right now, and document that back history so that you can actually show governments, look, you have been told 1,000 times or however many times that this is a problem. These are the remedies that consistently come forward. Here's the evidence about doing it. And then you get to make you can make a choice, I guess, because sometimes we said with Canada failed to take action on the inequalities and children died as a result. That's actually not true. Canada chose not to do it. Mm-hmm. And Canada is choosing not to fully remedy the inequalities right now. And when you're at that space, then you need to start reaching out to people who can do peaceful and respectful advocacy, for example, law professors. Who do litigation, pro bono litigation, who can tell you how to implement the evidence. Because if you're just generating more and more evidence to try and become more convincing with the government, when they already know the problem exists, they already know harms that are there, but they're just choosing for whatever reason not to implement it, then you need to move around to these other departments. And I find there's a lot of good people across different departments wanting to make a contribution in community.
Here's my second question from the audience. Thank you very much for this conversation. I could not agree with you more around the importance of courage in the academy and within the professions. In the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls final report, we wrote about the courage of family members in confronting violence and the need for society to be courageous in addressing these fundamental rights violations. My question is around the so-called helping services that so many Indigenous peoples have identified as, in fact, jeopardizing their rights. This includes services such as policing, child welfare, healthcare, education, and more. Do you have any ideas around how we as researchers can begin to transform this landscape so that helping professionals are, in fact, helping?
Yeah, I mean, when we look at some of the reactions of various professions to the TRC, for example, or missing Indigenous women and girls calls to justice, they've often been quick to say about how this is how we're going to action them, without taking the time to actually think about how our various professions and universities writ large were actually very much engaged in a colonial enterprise. How do we reform our various institutions? And this is a question that has been causing me a lot of curiosity lately. And I certainly don't have all the answers. But one of the things we're beginning to do is working on the intersection between mind control and colonialism. Mind control about how was society and these various safeguard institutions, including academia, so easily co-opted into the colonial enterprise. And then how do you walk that back? So I just want to put a shout out to Stephen Hassan, who we're working with in the United States. And we've done a couple of talks through our research site at the University of Alberta called FN Cares on colonialism and mind control. So take a look at that. I think that's one piece. The second is to actually create a timeline of your profession. Dr. Shaheen Hussain, who I just think is fabulous, he actually, through his activism as a medical academic, was able to get the government of Quebec to stop medically transporting Indigenous children from the north without anybody there to hold their hand. He actually wrote a book on medical colonialism that talks about the colonial ways that medicine was actually involved in the nutrition experiments of kids in residential schools. We have to lay our own history bare so that we can ask ourselves, are we actually better calibrated to meet the needs of people? It's not enough to know residential schools happen. It's not enough to know social work was a part of it. It's a question is, why aren't we doing more today? And we need to learn from those experiences in order to address those injustices. And check out the moral courage literature. And there's a great moral courage YouTube channel too, for those of you interested in how to learn about courage and teach courage.
Here's another question of talking about courage. I appreciate your stories. You mentioned love and courage and to focus on the evidence and the opportunities to restructure the systems within the academy for children. I reflect on this all the time, and I am landing on this concept of humanizing education at all levels. What are your thoughts on this idea? And is this happening at a grassroots level? Thank you.
Yeah, I love that idea of humanizing. I think the children showed us that, right? When they came into the courtroom and they wrote their letters to the Prime Minister. You know what's so interesting is Elder Elmer Cruikshank, late Cruikshank, he used to say loving justice. And I think for all my life, I'll be trying to understand what that truly means and how to do that better personally. But what I saw with the children is they would understand it immediately when the teachers would explain it to them. I remember the skill grade 1 teacher would say, you know, can you go home and turn on the taps and get a clean glass of water? Oh, yeah. What do you do with it? Well, we, do all these things. We give the dog a bath, we drink it. And then they say, well, what would it feel like if the stuff that came out of the tap, the water was brown and it made your stomach surge or it didn't come at all? Well, that's no good. Do you know there's kids in Canada where that happens? Oh, that's not good. But, we could all make this better. How about if we draw a picture for the Prime Minister to show them how important water is for kids and say that every kid deserves clean water? Could we do that? Kids get it right away. And that to me is that human piece is really building on that concept of loving justice and really showing people that, I've learned from the kids that you can't do sustainable human rights work with anger and tears. Mm-hmm. I remember I was blessed to actually meet with some of the civil rights leaders and Martin Luther King's family in 2018. And this one civil rights leader said that evil and anger don't organize well over the long run. They always fall apart, but love always holds together. And I think that we need to think about that in the way that we actually do this type of advocacy, make sure that we're laying down this foundation of love and humanity in everything we're doing.
Here's a good question. It sort of speaks to some of the things that we were talking about the last time we met, Cindy. It's Cindy, could you speak more about equitable indigenization of academic institutions for Indigenous students? What should institutions be doing to provide relevant education and connection to community?
Yeah, well, one of the things I think is looking at that thing I started with, don't have people make the choice. Really look at opportunities to support First Nations, Métis, and Inuit movements that are already happening out there, and really encourage and support not only your First Nations, Métis, and Inuit faculty and students to become engaged with that, but also the non-Indigenous students to become engaged with that in active reconciliation. The other piece I'd like to see is the tenure and promotion stuff. I think that needs to be recalibrated. Absolutely, you want excellence. We're not asking for anything but not excellence, but it's just opening up and providing more oxygen into what those concepts actually mean.
What kind of excellence are you looking at?
Exactly. Exactly. What does excellence look like, right?
Yes.
Because sometimes we just default to these old narratives for ourselves. I'd like to also see more welcoming of different forms of knowledge in university. I remember even as late as my PhD, I was, you have to pick a theory for your dissertation. And the ones on the menu were all the Western ones, which were taught in social work, right? And so it's like, it's weird. Like university is supposed to be a place where all new knowledge is welcome. Well, it is, as long as it's been cited before, right? Otherwise, you got to go through all this stuff. And I think we need to value oral history and different types of knowledges as credible. And in fact, I always point to the Delgamuukw case, not just because it comes from our nation, well, along with the Wet'suwet'en, but this is where the Supreme Court was testing out, among other legal concepts, the validity of First Nations knowledge. So very, very quickly, the government of British Columbia was saying there is no real land claim here because the Gitxsan, well, yeah, they've been around, but they only really existed when we saw them as colonizers, right? None of this, like we'd been around for a while. And so we had our oral history to put forward to show that. And the Supreme Court agreed that oral history is as valid as these other claims. And so we needed academia to kind of catch up to that, right? And open the doors to that kind of support. And we also need to deal with the pretend Indian problem in universities. We have to make sure, because that is a modern form of colonialism, and it takes away from the incredible contributions that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples are doing out there.
It takes funding and space and jobs and all of
that.
Yeah,
and almost is like a discrediting, because those of us who are out there, who are connected to the community, or though, and I always think about those who, through no fault of their own, were displaced from community and are on that journey of finding their way back. They might have been in a family with residential schools or in a child welfare placement. It makes you feel like you aren't really who you are. I mean, part of systemic racism is always the imposter system. It makes you question who you are. And it's made it very, very difficult. And so universities need to work with great people like Jean Tilley and Kim Tallbear and get that stuff sorted out.
Here's another question. Hi, Cindy. I wrote my master's thesis on links of Indigenous art and activism and how it can be utilized to raise awareness of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. How can we create space in academia areas that are colonized, which includes even Indigenous academia, that are not decolonized? Any tips on how we can decolonize in academia spaces as Indigenous students?
Wow, that's a really good question. The only way I kind of found it is to model it, right? I actually just do stuff, right? Like your work sounds fascinating. Like I am such a believer in bringing in different expressions of knowledge. In fact, I've dabbled in animation recently with a great group of Indigenous animators called Spotted Fawn Productions to give back the children's real life stories of how they were activists in Jordan's Principle and at the tribunal in these animated stories. There's so much power in the arts, and like holding an exhibit and showing people how it can be done, right? All of us have to kind of claim this space, right? I remember a South African activist when he's talking to a group of young people, and the young people were complaining that there wasn't much space at the UN for them to have a voice. So they said, you need to give us a voice. And he said, well, that's going to be a very long wait if that's your approach, is waiting to give a voice. He said, you must take it, but you must do it in a dignified and respectful way. So I'm looking forward to your art exhibit.
Here is another question. I think we probably have time for maybe this last one.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing your wisdom, Dr. Blackstock. Could you comment on or offer advice on tangible ways we can engage with the government to foster the change in their collective thinking? I've been doing research as a grad student on chemical contamination on Indigenous lands. The government programs have grand goals, but they still subtly or not so subtly perpetuate colonial relationships. The government doesn't seem to be aware of it. How can we challenge that outside of litigation?
All right. I'm not, the only way that I found it helpful is by joining together social movement and litigation. But because the government's not at a place of reformation itself, that deep thinking that's necessary to reform itself. And I've seen it, for example, on residential schools, and I want to just pay my respects to the children in unmarked graves and the communities who are reconciling with that and trying to locate those children and connect them. But in the wake of that, we saw people activating in the public, horrified at what the government had done. And at the same time, we had the government litigating against this generation of kids in our case. The same week that the Kamloops came out, we were actually going to court, preparing to go to court against Canada. I think that, you know, you will find what happens in government is they are very good at amnesia. And I have lived long enough where I see the same tape playing over and over again, right? I get a new minister, a new government. They tell me that the old government was wrong. This is a new day. Just be patient with us. We need a few more budget cycles. We're going to be making a difference. We've done more than any other government. And then those bureaucrats move on even within the same government, and you get the same thing. What we need to do is work to illuminate and disrupt those patterns of behavior and disrupt our pattern of behavior, which has been so often just trying to convince them to do better. And that's what I mean about getting locked in procedure. If you get locked there and you forget about what it's actually doing in the meantime, the harm is happening in the meantime. And so I think litigation and looking at social movements and other types of mechanisms to bring pressure on the government, including things like access to information requests. We have to get more imaginative in the academic circle and less tolerant of this inertia that we're seeing. And that, frankly, they are aware of it. If we look at reports from the public service, et cetera, there's a lot of awareness within the public service that there's all these issues that have been just running around and not being solved. So we got to help. I always looked at this, and I said this at the tribunal. If the kids win, the country does too. And it sounds to me from your story, if your evidence works and wins, then the country will too. Sometimes we need to follow the advice of governments don't create change, they respond to change. And sometimes we need help we need to give them the boost to do that.
Cindy Blackstock, thank you so much for your time today. It's been fascinating and really inspiring to hear about your courage and your goal of loving justice and just all of the work that you've been doing. It's really great. I want to thank you and also SSHRC for hosting both of us today and the Conversation Canada. And I don't know if you have any last words that you would like to say.
Yeah, you can actually find on our website, fnkaringsociety.com, Benita, 7 free ways to make a difference for First Nations kids in under 2 minutes. So everybody on this call can do that and become an active part of the change that the TRC calls to action are. They're really the survivors' work plan for the country. And so we all have an opportunity to implement that work plan as well as murdered, missing Indigenous women. What a pleasure to talk to you, Benita. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you to SSHRC. I'm so very grateful for all the great service that they do.
Thank you so much.